On a cold winter morning in New York, Richard Hale sat alone by the window of a warm, upscale café. He was a man who had everything money could buy: luxury, influence, comfort, but his heart carried the heavy weight of loneliness. Outside, the city bustled beneath a sky heavy with snow, the wind biting through the coats of hurried pedestrians. Richard sipped his coffee, staring blankly at the street, detached from the world beyond the glass. Then, something caught his eye: a small figure standing just outside the café. It was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9, dressed in tattered clothes that did nothing to keep out the cold. Her cheeks were red from the wind, her thin hands pressed against the window as she gazed at the display of cakes and pastries inside. There was a quiet longing in her eyes, the kind that spoke of hunger, not just for food, but for warmth and care. Richard watched her for a moment, feeling a flicker of something unfamiliar stir in his chest. People passed her without a glance, as if she were invisible. She didn't knock on the glass or beg, she simply stood there, shivering, her breath fogging the window as she stared at the golden slices of cake stacked on porcelain plates. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard found himself unable to look away. The contrast between his comfortable corner and her fragile figure in the snow was too stark to ignore. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet unease began to take root, as if this small, shivering child was about to change something in his life, though he had no idea just how much. In that moment, the warmth of the café felt strangely cold. The waiter had just set down Richard's favorite cake, a slice of rich chocolate layered with cream, the kind he always ordered when he needed a small comfort. The warm aroma drifted upward, but before he could pick up his fork, the café door burst open with a sharp jingle of the bell. It was the same little girl from outside. Snow clung to her hair, and her tiny chest rose and fell as she struggled to catch her breath. Eyes darting around the room, she hurried straight to Richard's table. Her voice trembled, barely more than a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the soft hum of chatter. "Sir, she put something in your cake." Her small finger pointed toward a waitress who was now retreating toward the counter, her face pale and unreadable. The room seemed to hold its breath. A couple at the next table froze mid-bite. The barista glanced over, eyebrows raised. Richard stared at the girl, his mind racing. Was this some kind of scam? A misunderstanding? He looked down at the cake, perfect, untouched, yet suddenly less inviting. Then he met the child's eyes. They were wide, frightened, but there was no hint of mischief or deceit. She wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to win his favor. She was shaking as if the words she'd just spoken had cost her something. Richard shifted his gaze to the waitress, who avoided looking at him entirely, her hands busy with a tray that didn't need arranging. The air in the café felt heavier now, and the sweet scent of chocolate had been replaced by an unsettling tension. Richard didn't yet know the truth, but one thing was certain: his quiet morning had just been shattered. Richard raised his hand slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Miss, could you come here for a moment?" The waitress hesitated, her knuckles tightening around the tray before setting it down. She walked over slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor, as though each step toward him was heavier than the last. "What's in the cake?" he asked quietly, his gaze steady. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes glistened, and she blinked rapidly as if holding back a flood. Finally, her voice broke through, fragile and trembling. "It's not what you think." She reached for the plate and carefully lifted the slice of cake, revealing a small, folded piece of paper pressed beneath the layers. Richard unfolded it with deliberate slowness. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly smudged. It was a plea, simple, desperate, and painfully sincere. She was begging for help to pay for her mother's surgery, explaining that every door she had knocked on had stayed shut. She wrote that she had seen his face in the café before, had overheard people speak of his wealth, and thought, perhaps foolishly, that he might be her last hope. "I couldn't ask you directly," she said, her voice cracking. I thought you'd just turn me away." people usually do. The cafe had fallen into complete silence now. Richard looked up at her, this young woman with tired eyes, standing there with her heart laid bare in the most awkward, vulnerable way. And then his gaze shifted to the little girl, still by his table, watching him with the kind of cautious hope only someone who'd known hardship could understand. For the first time that morning, Richard felt something shift deep inside him. This was no longer about cake, it was about a choice. Whispers began to ripple through the cafe like a low tide. Some customers shook their heads in disapproval, muttering about manipulation and deceit. Others softened, their eyes filled with pity for the trembling waitress. A man at the corner table scoffed audibly, while a woman by the window dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Richard sat perfectly still, the folded note resting on the table before him. His fingers traced its edges, his gaze fixed somewhere distant. The waitress stood frozen in place, wringing her hands, while the little beggar girl lingered nearby, clutching the hem of her worn dress. At last, Richard turned to the child. His voice was calm, almost curious. "You could have stayed outside. You could have waited until I ate the cake, or even taken it for yourself. Why warn me?" The girl shifted from foot to foot, avoiding his eyes at first. Then she looked up, her expression simple and unshaken. "Because it's wrong to hurt people, even rich ones." The words landed heavier than their small voice suggested. The cafe seemed to quiet again, as though everyone was waiting for Richard's response. He studied her for a long moment, trying to understand how someone with so little could still carry such a sense of right and wrong. There was no calculation in her face, no trace of expectation, only the plain truth of her answer. Somewhere deep inside, a warmth began to spread through Richard's chest, pushing back against the cold armor he'd worn for years. This wasn't just a choice about money. This was about what kind of man he wanted to be when he walked out of that cafe. Richard slowly rose from his chair, the quiet creak of the wood breaking the tense stillness. Every eye in the cafe followed him as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, leather-bound checkbook. He didn't rush. He opened it with the same deliberate care one might give to something sacred. The waitress's eyes widened, her breath catching as she realized what he was doing. Richard began to write, the pen gliding smoothly across the paper. The first check, enough to cover the full cost of her mother's surgery, he folded gently and pressed into her trembling hands. "Take care of her," he said softly, his tone carrying both command and compassion. Then he turned to the little girl. She looked startled, unsure why his attention was on her. He wrote again, this time slower, the numbers smaller but no less important. "For your education," he said, handing her the slip of paper. "Use it to build a life where you'll never have to stand in the cold like this again." The girl blinked, as though the weight of the moment hadn't yet settled on her small shoulders. A slow, hesitant smile began to form, her first of the day, perhaps the first in a long time. Richard glanced around the cafe, his voice low but clear. "Kindness is the rarest treasure in this city. And today, I found it twice." Outside, snow drifted gently from the gray sky, blanketing the streets in white. Richard stepped out into the cold, but this time the air didn't bite as sharply. There was a warmth in him now, one that had nothing to do with the coffee he'd left behind. And as the door closed, the little girl's smile lingered like a quiet light in the winter gloom. In the end, what began as an ordinary morning for Richard Hale became a quiet turning point in his life. A lonely millionaire, a desperate waitress, and a shivering little girl crossed paths in a small cafe, and in a single hour, walls built over years began to crumble. The truth slipped into the open not through confrontation, but through the courage of a child who chose honesty over opportunity. From that choice came compassion, and from compassion, change. Richard walked away not just having given money, but having received something far rarer, a reminder that kindness is still alive, even in the harshest winters of the human heart. The waitress left with hope for her mother's life, and the little girl with the promise of a future she never dared imagine. And for everyone who witnessed it, the moment stood as proof that even the smallest act of truth can set in motion a chain of generosity that warms far beyond the people it touches. Somewhere in the falling snow, a man who thought he had everything discovered that the greatest wealth is found not in what we keep, but in what we give away.